if the images of that we were exposed to coming out of Gaza have been images that were associated with a group that had been racialized as white, images of starving children, people being burnt to death in hospital beds and tents outside of the hospital, images of people who are being raped by their tormentors. That war wouldn't have lasted for a few days. But because the Palestinians have been racialized as non-white, they become killable. This division between the humans, white people, and the non-humans, people of color, has had a profound impact on the consciousness of people globally.
But what's interesting that Zionism is the ultimate form of identity politics, for example, since your relationship to the state in Israel is totally dependent upon your ethno-religious identity. And of course, Bernie Sanders used to live in Israel. And of course, he has critiques of Netanyahu, not necessarily critiques of the Zionist entity itself.
No.
What we really need, among other things, is for some of those defined as white to own up to their multiple identities and to recognize that when they throw out this allegation of identity politics, in many ways, they're sort of describing themselves.
It always struck me that when you look, start with the Russians, when you look at the Russian Federation, and you look at the construction of the Russian bourgeoisie, there was always the element of that bourgeoisie that just wanted to be white, that just wanted to associate and be a part of the Western white world. If you don't really understand the full range and implications of race, then you're not going to be able to read between the lines of your adversary, meaning from the point of view of the Russians, the Iranians, and the Chinese. But I think that they have finally come to a conclusion or a better understanding of what it is they're dealing with when they're dealing with the white West.
U.S. imperialism is in decline. And when a system such as this is in decline, of course, all bets are off.
But let me warn you. I may not be talking as much as I normally do because, whenever I'm doing something with Dr. Horne, I tend to kind of get fixated by what he's saying. I forget about what I should be saying.
Well, that makes three of us then.
All right. Okay. All right. Good day, everyone. We are here today with Ajamu Baraka and Gerald Horne, two very well-known individuals who are part of the activist scene, especially known also for their anti-racist and anti-imperialist stance on many issues. In particular, I would say you two are very vocal and have a very good analysis also when it comes to white supremacy, something that I, as a social psychologist, also find extremely interesting and important. And just quickly, Ajamu Baraka, of course, was also a Green Party runner for the vice president of the United States back in the day. And Gerald Horne is a professor at the University of Houston. I think our audience is very familiar with both of you. And I wanted to ask you a question. First, a broad question. Maybe you can tie it to what's going on in Gaza, maybe also Venezuela, maybe Trump. But I wanted to ask you guys a very broad question and answer it the way you want and tie it to any issue of today you want. My question is, when we talk about white supremacy, a lot of people often get icky, like, oh, and why do you have to talk about white supremacy and identities? And it's about class, and people try to reject it and say, class is what it's all about, and we should stop talking about race. And I always say, I understand where it comes from, but it's a very easy thing to say when you're not on the receiving end of white supremacy and racism. So my question is why, when it comes to the world that we live in today, an analysis of white supremacy and racism is still very crucial? What would you say to those people? And maybe we can start with Professor Horne.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, this is being taped, I take it, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So, with regard to your latter question, there's sort of conceptual confusion. For example, with regard to the United States of America, when you're talking about race, oftentimes you're referring to the descendants of the unpaid sector of the working class, that is to say, the enslaved population in the first instance. And so when you're mentioning race, among other things, you're mentioning class almost by definition. But it's actually deeper than that, because as I've tried to point out in my own work, if you look at the root of these concepts, particularly whiteness and white supremacy, you see that it stems in no small measure from religion. That is to say, after His Catholic Majesty in España, in Spain, got a first mover's advantage in terms of competition with the Western European nations in particular by sponsoring the freebooter Christopher Columbus, and the other nations, particularly London, wanted to join the feast. Conveniently for London in 1517, Martin Luther executed a secession from the Vatican, which was picked up by London, picked up by the king, not least because it allowed the king to expropriate Catholic property and fatten his purse. But at the same time, it ignited a round robin of religious wars between Protestants and Catholics that rocked the 16th century. Improvisationally, you saw that the Protestant underdog in London began to try to co opt those with whom it had been warring. I'm speaking of Irish, for example, Scots, for example, Welsh, for example. And this leads inevitably to the reality that when London crosses the Atlantic to try to join in on the feast, that is to say, to expropriate and liquidate the indigenous population, the wind in their sails, in many ways, is the fact that they're able to co opt those with whom they had been warring. And then that remit was expanded to exclude those on the continent with whom they had been warring. That is to say, not only English versus Irish versus Welsh versus Scots, but versus German versus Pole versus Russian, Russian versus Lithuanian, Lithuanian versus Polish, Serb versus Croat. All of a sudden, when all of these European ethnic groups cross the Atlantic in a maneuver that would make Madison Avenue blush, they are rebranded as, quote, white, unquote, which of course inevitably bleeds into white supremacy. And if any if any objection can be made, it could be to the point that whiteness is actually broader than Europeans. I mean, I oftentimes use the term Euro-American because I'm still uneasy about the term white and whiteness, but in many ways it's misleading because, as noted, religion bleeds into race. That is to say, it's no accident that those who had been subjected to religious persecution, the Jewish minority in Europe in the first instance, expelled from England as late as, or as early, I should say, as the end of the 13th century. Of course, many of them are incorporated into the hallowed halls of whiteness. But more than that, Lebanese Christians like Ralph Nader, Egyptian Christians, for example, Syrian Christians, for example, are incorporated into the hallowed halls of whiteness. And in fact, part of the difficulty, I'm afraid to say, some of us have had in North America in aligning with many of our Arab and Arab American friends is that they understand, they cling to this whiteness concept because, of course, it's a kind of property, it's a kind of privilege, but at the same time, of course, is of deteriorating, declining value. It complicates their relations with others with whom there should be in lines, for example, the Black American population. And so, speaking of declining value, obviously, that is a reality that has to be considered and contemplated when you consider United States relations with Asia, for example. I mean, it's no accident, as the historians like to say, that some of the bloodiest wars that U.S. imperialism in particular has been involved in have been in Asia, with regard to Korea, Vietnam, in the first instance. And it's difficult to understand this current conflict with the People's Republic of China without understanding racial anxiety, for example, and the fact that with China in the passing lane, a system that had seemed to be eternal and certainly had been in existence for hundreds of years, perhaps 400 and 500 years, is now being challenged. And obviously, that's going to create anxiety. And at the same time, as a person who lived through the period when U.S. imperialism was involved in an entente with the People's Republic of China against the then Soviet Union, it was very difficult for many to accept that Washington may have been turning its back on its so-called racial comrades in Moscow in favor of the Asians in Beijing. Uh, and of course, this should not be surprising because in the 16th century, for example, as noted, His Catholic Majesty had to confront the reality that Protestant London was making deals with the Ottomans against the interests of the Christian comrades in España, for example. Or, for that matter, at the beginning of the 20th century, you saw London banks helping to finance the Japanese attack on Russia, which was a turning point, not only in terms of the global correlation of forces, helping to set the stage for the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, but also, once again, it was difficult for many to accept or to understand or believe that London would be supposedly turning its back against its alleged racial comrades in Moscow on behalf of Tokyo. So I understand the difficulty that some have in understanding history, because particularly in this country, the United States of America, the teaching of history is under attack. Museums are under attack. Books are being withdrawn from libraries, for example. As I've been telling many audiences, when I have a microphone before me, as my late mother might have said about her son, me, pray for me, because this situation is really spinning out of control. But at the same time, it's understandable from my point of view why these concepts are difficult to grasp.
Yeah, and if I can quickly jump in, then I'll hand it to you, Ajamu. I would also say I just heard an interview of between some right wingers online, and one of those guys, I don't know if he's a right winger, but the platform was a right wing platform. But there was a Muslim guy was interviewed by them, and they were like, yeah, what do you think about white people and the suffering of white people in this country or something? And then this Muslim guy said, like, well, technically I'm white. I'm from Iran, so and we're Aryan. And even though he was pale skinned, of course, and he looked European, ethnic European in some way, shape, or form, I thought to myself, that's a very historically inaccurate idea of whiteness, because whiteness, of course, was a colonial identity, and Iranians were never part of that colonial identity. So you can be a light-skinned Iranian or a light-skinned Lebanese or a light-skinned, and I understand in America often they are incorporated into whiteness, but from a historical point of view, whiteness, of course, was a colonial identity that oppressed other groups of people, and all these formerly colonized people or societies that were not part of the colonial empire, of course, were never part of the identity of whiteness. So I always find it very, very weird when people say that and when they want to be included. And also, by the way, let's not forget Zionism itself, which I would say is a form of white supremacy, indeed. But I don't know. Any thoughts, Ajamu, on this?
Well, I think that you're hitting on, of course, I really appreciate the historic perspective that Dr. Horne laid out in terms of the evolution of this concept. But you're also talking about a phenomenon that's very, very interesting, because this notion of whiteness it no longer can be reduced to a geographical area. It is in fact a concept that has a meaning almost independent of the social and historical realities people find themselves in. This individual who you referenced, who said technically I'm white, I mean, what he meant was that there is a concept of whiteness that's connected to the concept of being fully human. That is related to notions of civilization, superiority, and the color of the skin is almost a byproduct of that, an accidental byproduct, if you will. This division between the humans, white people, and the non-humans, people of color, has had a profound impact on the consciousness of people globally. And so there is this subconscious or identification with whiteness as something to embrace, something that's superior, something that one wants to identify with if they can. And that's what makes it so incredibly dangerous. And that's why it's important for people to understand the full complexities of this concept. For example, how can one explain the Gaza without bringing in the concept of race, the concept of white supremacy, the concept of whiteness? If the images that we were exposed to coming out of Gaza have been images that were associated with a group that had been racialized as white, images of starving children, people being burnt to death in hospital beds and tents outside of the hospital, images of people who are being raped by their tormentors. That war wouldn't have lasted for a few days. But because the Palestinians have been racialized as non-white, they become killable. They become subjected to these kinds of behaviors, if you will. And what we then see and experience is 2 years of genocide. So this concept is a powerful concept in making these kinds of divisions. And as Dr. Horne shared with us, the concept is flexible. That one can be non-white when it comes to European descendants one day and white the next. And I agree with you that basically Zionism is a doctrine that's now been racialized, that goes beyond notions of religion, and it reflects a notion of white supremacy. So these are this is a very dangerous concept that we have to bring into play in all of our analysis of all of the political issues, the political challenges we see globally. You can't understand even the attacks that are being allowed against the people of Venezuela without bringing in the issue of race. So this is a powerful concept that people need to grapple with. And this tendency on the part of many people in the West to want to avoid this or want to reduce everything just to the issue of class is just an example of the inability to understand how deeply embedded these concepts are and how deeply embedded the concepts are within themselves.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Venezuela because I wanted to ask a related question. So I'm wondering what you guys think about the motivations behind the recent spree of killings by missile in the Caribbean, and also, of course, the Trump administration's naval moves right around the coast of Venezuela and all of the threats. We heard that they've authorized some sort of CIA operation, etc. I'm wondering, do you see this more as a kind of emanation of the I don't know how to put it other than the right wing racist crazy or craziness in the U.S. kind of lashing out at the bogeymen that have been created in the right wing media? Uh, because it's also, of course, related to the whole anti-immigration crackdown. It seems like it's all of the same piece. On the other hand, there's the national defense strategy that still hasn't come out, but the leaks about it have suggested that the Trump wing of the foreign policy establishment is trying to move away from China, perhaps because they realize that a war against China wouldn't go as swimmingly as they may have initially expected. And now they're getting a little nervous, so they're seeking to consolidate their power base by dominating the Western Hemisphere ever more to obtain all of the raw materials that they need for a future war with China. So in that sense, it would be like taking a few steps back so that you can leap forward ever further. How do you guys see this? Do you see it as one or the other, or a mix of both, or something else entirely?
Well, I'll defer to Ajamu since he's in the region.
Well, very briefly, I would suggest that what we have here is a policy that, as you laid out in your question, is quite rational. That there is a recognition that part of the maintenance of U.S. global hegemony has to be the reconsolidation, if you will, of their own quote unquote backyard here in the Western Hemisphere. Right now, the major trading partners of many of the nations in the Western Hemisphere is China. And so, therefore, there's a recognition that as part of the global strategy to try to contain China, one has to sort of shore up, if you will, your backyard. So that element is something that makes sense. And remember now, too, part of the national security strategy that's not going to, I don't think, change much, is the commitment to the idea of regional hegemony. The attacks on Venezuela is not so much an unhinged unleashing of the U.S. forces against that country, but part of the recognized objective to maintain control of the region means to control and contain Venezuela and his ability to influence politics and the economy in the Americas. So it's a very rational policy to continue the maximum pressure that's been applied to Venezuela. I mean, look, if you look at the kind of weight that nations like Qatar and the UAE and the Saudis have, who have been able to utilize their petroleum wealth, if you will, to advance their particular global interests. And then you remind yourself of the fact that Venezuela has the largest known reserves of petroleum on the planet. If Venezuela had been allowed to operate naturally, if you will, in the global economy, then it would have the ability, the resources to be able to influence not only the politics of the region, but global politics. So the control of Venezuela is key for controlling the Americas and is a very important part, I believe, in their strategy against the Chinese. Now, the other element of this, too, in terms of the resource concerns of the U.S., I make the argument that, the only way one can explain the kind of policies that we saw uh, between the U.S. and the Europeans vis-a-vis the Chinese, where it seemed like the U.S. authorities were doing everything in their power to basically uh, push the Europeans into the arms of the Chinese. People were saying that if the real concern on the part of the Trump administration was China, why would you pursue policies that would alienate your main allies? Well, I'll argue that basically what they had concluded was the instrument to control China is the control of resources. And the geographical area to do that is West Asia. And so I think the main thrust of their policies over this last 9 months or so has been to shore up their relationships, their policies, and controlling the resources of West Asia. You control the major sources of petroleum, including now Venezuela, and basically you are striking at the underbelly of vulnerability of China.
Your
And
thoughts,
of course,
Professor Horne?
yeah, well, of course, and there's another way uh, as well to look at it, which is that U.S. imperialism is in decline. And when a system such as this is in decline, of course, all bets are off. And it's easy to convert erstwhile allies into chickens to be plucked. Hence the attempt to annex Canada, hence the attempt to seize Denmark's colony in Greenland, to take over the Panama Canal, extortion like tariffs on Britain and the EU, etc. It seems to me it bespeaks a certain kind of desperation, which of course was magnified on September 3rd, 2025, with that military parade in Beijing. I hadn't seen such anxiety on the faces of the minions of Wall Street and Washington since the 2008 2009 collapse on Wall Street, when then US President George W. Bush said quite infamously about the capitalist system that, quote, this sucker may go down, unquote. Well, you saw the same kind of anxiety just a few weeks ago. But if I may, I'd like to also return to the historical point, which is that I think that U.S. imperialism is boastful and proud of the fact that it has been able to incorporate the Jewish minority much more effectively, they would argue, than happened in Europe. Whereas noted, they were expelled from England at the end of the 13th century. We don't have to fast forward to the Holocaust. But at the same time, it's been a dual relationship. There's been an incorporation, for example, the brains behind the slave owning Confederates who tried to secede in 1861 to perpetuate enslavement of Africans forevermore was Judah P. Benjamin, a Jewish man who, of course, wound up in exile in London. I think I might have mentioned to you chaps before that if you're fans of U.S. professional football, you're probably aware of Derrick Henry, who hails from Yulee, Florida, named after a Jewish senator from slave-owning Florida. But at the same time, I think that anti-Jewish fervor is used as a cudgel to keep the Jewish members of the ruling class in line. And because of this duality, it's difficult for many to grasp the two-sided nature of this phenomenon. For example, I've been recommending that someone needs to do a new book about the Leo Frank case. This is a case from about 110 years ago in Georgia where a Jewish factory manager or owner is lynched by Protestant members of his class under the guise of a blood libel. That is to say, that supposedly they're killing Christians to drink their blood. And what's remarkable about this case is that the main witness against Leo Frank was the black janitor. And the racists chose to accept the testimony of the black janitor over the Jewish Defense Council, the Defense Council for Leo Frank, for example. And of course, this has tremendous impact on U.S. politics. It causes affluent German Jewish people to pour money into the NAACP, the National Association for Advancement of Colored People. And that kind of relationship has gone up and down over the decades, but at that time it was quite significant. And I think it's also led to a certain kind of confusion amongst many of our Jewish American friends. I mean, you see it in Bernie Sanders, for example, the supposed leader of the progressive forces in the United States, this senior senator from Vermont, who, when Trump prevailed in November 2024, he said it was due to identity politics. And I'm not sure what that means. Oftentimes it's used to invoke those in the Black liberation movement because supposedly we don't pay enough attention to class, which helped to launch this particular conversation. Perhaps he was referring to the trans movement. But what's interesting is that Zionism is the ultimate form of identity politics, for example, since your relationship to the state in Israel is totally dependent upon your ethno-religious identity. And of course, Bernie Sanders used to live in Israel. And of course, he has critiques of Netanyahu, not necessarily critiques of the Zionist entity itself.
No.
And so I began to think that the way to think about some of these identities amongst those who are defined as white in the United States, it's like the difference between a stick shift and automatic shift when you're driving a car. So some might not recall that at one time with a stick shift, you had to go from first to second to third, and you had a clutch, etc. And then with automatic, it takes place for you. And so what happens is that this whiteness identity is so pervasive that it tends to kick in automatically, and people sort of don't even necessarily realize that that's what they're putting forward. For example, as they shift between Jewish identity, white identity, for example, you see the same thing with some of our Irish American friends, many of whom, of course, were anti-London historically because of the Irish question, but were joining in with the bashing of Black people, for example, as they put on their white identity cap, for example. And so what we really need, among other things, is for some of those defined as white to own up to their multiple identities and to recognize that when they throw out this allegation of identity politics, in many ways, they're sort of describing themselves unwittingly.
Yeah, yeah, very
And
well
let me
said.
throw in
Ajamu,
another
you wanted to
element to
jump in?
this too, that I find interesting in terms of this notion of whiteness and the connection to class. You know, the white supremacist ideology cannot be reducible to race. It is something that can be embraced, not just embraced, but something that can be absorbed by all kinds of people, all kinds of ethnic groups, if you will, that will see. But the underlying connecting tissue of that is the tendency to see the superiority of the West, of the white West, as natural. And so, even though they may be members of the bourgeois class, a capital class in Sri Lanka, if you will, there is a psychological connection that they have to the cosmopolitanism of the international bourgeoisie that culturally, psychologically, emotionally also is defined as white and whiteness. So there's a weird phenomenon, in my opinion, that one sees that gives this phenomenon of race a class character that's very, very interesting when it comes to the bourgeoisie.
Absolutely, absolutely, and you see it here as well in Asia. I mean, I lived in Malaysia, Hong Kong, and you still see that kind of. Well, you see how successful colonialism created that distinction between the local population, of course, and then the bourgeoisie, the elites, and then of course the white British or Dutch, and you still see that today. That idea that especially among the let's say at the top universities, people still really identify with the West and see it as the like kind of liberal bastion of the world and all that kind of stuff. It's a very successful kind of indoctrination, and I also like the psychological part that you mentioned, Ajamu, about the fact that you will see that a lot of people identify with whiteness, also Arabs, for example, or Persians, because it gives you a sense of humanity. Like it gives you the idea that you are worthy. A lot of people are not don't identify as white because they want to be white because I don't know, they like the look of it or something, but actually because you are fully human if you are considered as white. I think that's extremely powerful psychological aspect, and that's also why you often see women painting their hair blonde and all that kind of stuff, and they will say, oh, it's just because my I look so harsh when I have black hair. And I'm like, where does it come from that you look harsh, that we conditioned the idea that you look harsh when you have black hair? You know what I mean? Or all that bleaching stuff and then yeah, well, I could go on for hours on that whole psychological aspect. But I wanted to relate this question also to something that I've seen and we have discussed on this channel a lot. And it's a very sensitive issue we have noticed on the left. And that is the following. I personally am a big fan of the rise of the global south, also of the BRICS nation, and in particular China. We have been very, very positive about that, Peter and myself. But I also must say, after 2 years of unending genocide, I have become a little bit disappointed, to say it very mildly, with regards to many of the global South nations, the BRICS nations, and in particular the powerful ones such as Russia or China. Why am I saying this? I've seen a very good analysis, a very long article online. We will also talk to somebody who did a lot of work on that, called Professor Patrick Bond from South Africa, who is quite critical of the BRICS nations and sees it as an integration into the imperialist capitalist bloc. And China, for example, has every year increased its massive trade with Israel during a genocide, despite all the positive rhetoric, you could say, with regards to the Palestinians, for example, in the UN. Now, we had a couple of guests on, for example, Vanessa Beeley and Fiorella Isabel, who said we are also seeing a kind of learned helplessness among the global South people. That is, you come out of hundreds of years of Western white supremacist, imperialist, capitalist world, and it seems that after 2 years of genocide, there is this kind of internalized helplessness among the global South to take action, to take bold action, to try and stop something that happened to them and their ancestors for many years. My question is, how would you evaluate what's going on vis-a-vis the genocide and the reaction of the global South?
Well, I'll begin. I'm writing something right now that in part re-examines one of the pivotal episodes of the late 20th century. We're marking the anniversary this month, October 2025. I'm speaking October 1965, when a U.S. and London-backed coup in Indonesia led to what could be called a political genocide. That is to say, the attempted liquidation, not wholly unsuccessful, of the Communist Party of Indonesia, which to that point had been one of the most powerful in the region, if not globally, and of course had drawn heavily upon Indonesians of Chinese ancestry. And as I plan to tell the story, I'm also going to see this as a more than muted signal to Beijing, as another factor one must consider when contemplating what unfolds a few years later with the Entente between Washington and Beijing. That is to say, accept the Entente or face liquidation, or as it's often said by U.S. imperialism in its policy due south in Central America, such as in El Salvador, beams or rifles. frijoles o fusiles, for example. Take your pick. and so, and then likewise with regard to Russia, let's face it. I was old enough to recall the height of the Cold War, when basically on the table with regard to the Soviet Union was either retreat or face the prospect of the entire planet being blown to smithereens, including Moscow. So I would factor in those sorts of considerations when talking about the US backed genocide in Gaza. And I would also see it as an elongated process. Already, you see China, as the United States supposedly clamors for decoupling. China is actually executing decoupling, since exports to the United States are now in the single digits. And of course, this ASEAN meeting coming up in a few days will help to punctuate that. And if I may, I'd return to our original concept, which is that with regard to U.S. policy and whiteness and white supremacy, it's been sort of a carrot which they could dangle before colonized peoples, which allows the United States to portray itself as being more benevolent and more progressive. I mean, for example, there's a U.S. Supreme Court case from 110 years ago where the U.S. is basically saying that Syrians could be incorporated into whiteness, for example. Not necessarily Ottoman Turks, of course, the colonial master, but Syrians can. And of course, we know that fast forwarding 5 decades later, the United States, particularly then Senator John Kennedy, was making rhetorical gestures towards the Algerians as they were in a death match with the colonizer in France, for example, which could lead the naive to believe that the United States is more progressive and liberal. And in fact, that's what people were saying. And actually, it was a matter of U.S. imperialism trying to still a march against French imperialism, basically. And so these are very complicated questions that we're dealing with. And given that, I understand why oftentimes some of the nuances are not grasped fully.
Ajamu?
I'm going to hold off for a second because there's a tremendous amount of noise outside my window.
No worries. Actually, if I could follow up on that, you brought up the Cold War history, and the thing that this question makes me think of when I see some people talk about it online is the strategy of the CIA during the Cold War to foster a compatible left, that is a left compatible with empire. When you talk to younger activists now, how do you try to tell them that story and the lessons, more importantly, I guess, the lessons they should learn from that in terms of how they should, analyze the world, the evaluations they should make, their political action? Is there anything from that historical episode that you think is relevant now and could be imparted to the next generation?
Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to hear almost anything that Professor Horne said. There was a tremendous amount of noise outside, and I barely heard the question. Can we repeat the question?
Can I repeat the first question then? Yeah. So I was asking Ajamu. I don't know if you caught that. Do you remember that I talked about the global South and the inaction? Yeah. So how do you evaluate that relative inaction? Would you also say that's a kind of learned helplessness after colonialism, or would you say there are other factors, in particular the increasing trade of China with Israel during the genocide? Every year it goes up. I'm very surprised and kind of shocked by that. How would you explain that the global South has not really made a fist and say until here and no further? How would you explain that?
Well, I share your concern. I share the disappointment that certain states did not have not taken a more forthright position on the genocide question. And I think it's something that we have to really begin to discuss. There's a lot of elements that are positive with this development of this whole BRICS process, but there are also many contradictions in it too. And I think some of those contradictions were exposed with the Gaza genocide situation. The fact of the matter is that not only did trade increase between Israel and the Chinese these last 2 years, but there was increases even with the Russians, and we know that there's always been a very close relationship between the personality of Netanyahu and Putin. We know that there was collaboration around between those two nations that had a significant impact, a detrimental impact, in my opinion, on the situation in Syria. Okay, that the Syrians were never allowed to have the capabilities of being able to protect Syrian airspace from the intrusions of Israel. So there's a lot of funky, great power relationships that are taking place. And we have been maybe sometimes liberal in not dealing with some of those contradictions. Now, I know that Professor Bond is very, very famous in terms of elaborating a theoretical framework with his notion of sub-imperialism to suggest that there's a material aspect to this that helps to explain the behavior of these states. But I think on the part of both the Chinese and the Russians, I think that what I have seen, in my opinion, has been a bit of a maturation, if you will, in terms of them understanding the real terms of struggle between themselves and the West, and the U.S. in particular. That going back to this notion of subconscious whiteness, it always struck me that when you look, start with the Russians. When you look at the Russian Federation, and you look at the construction of the Russian bourgeoisie, there was always an element of that bourgeoisie that just wanted to be white, that just wanted to associate and be a part of the Western white world. And that was a very, I think, powerful instrument or weapon that some elements, some of the more insightful elements within the U.S. Tried to play on. That's why they moved to include the Russians in the G7. It became the G8 for a moment. Okay, because they wanted to experiment with the idea that they could in fact utilize the Russians in the war against their main enemy, which of course was the emerging Chinese. And I think they were making some success until they started to make mistakes with that relationship, and basically ended up forcing or pushing the Russians back east again. I think the same element can be said for some elements in China. I remember being a little shocked my first visit to China, and having the opportunity to engage with Chinese intellectuals, Chinese party members at very high levels. I was somewhat shocked at what appeared to be a certain kind of naivete when it came to how they perceive how the West, in particular the U.S., perceive them. They they really believed that they were dealing with rational actors. They didn't have an understanding of the white colonial mentality, and so they kept on getting caught. As a consequence of not being able to anticipate certain moves being made by the West and the U.S. and specifically. But I think over the last few years, I think there's been a recognition, especially when it comes to both the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians, because I detected the same kind of naivety among high-level officials in Iran that, the white colonial mentality is something that for those of us who have had intimate knowledge of it, intimate relationship with it, it is a lot easier for us to anticipate the kinds of positions they may take and to provide an analysis that won't lead us into delusional kinds of policies. But if you don't have a lot of experience with that mentality, if you don't really understand the full range and implications of race, then you're not going to be able to read between the lines of your adversary, uh, meaning from the point of view of the Russians, the Iranians, and the Chinese. But I think that they have finally come to a conclusion or a better understanding of what it is they're dealing with when they're dealing with the White West. And the concern I have, though, with that also is this. I'm concerned about the real possibility of in the West, the development of a cross-class white supremacist movement, that this appeal to whiteness, this subconscious and sometimes conscious appeal to whiteness, in the light of the emerging global South, in light of the continuation of the contradictions of the capitalist system, that we're going to find more and more Europeans, both in Europe and Euro Americans, who, when push comes to shove, will embrace their white identity to the detriment of the rest of us. I'm very, very concerned about that. And you see examples of that in some of the in positions that people are taking. You look at the fact that there's been no real opposition to the plight of Venezuela, the pending attack on Venezuela among the left forces in both Europe and the U.S. You see this in the elements of the left, so-called left, adopting certain terms like wokeness, the whole severe critique of so-called of identity, not recognizing that the predominant phenomenon politically among the white West is in fact white identity politics. But people seem like they don't see that. So it is a very worrying phenomenon. But I think that staying with the issue of the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians, I think that there is a recognition now that they have to toughen up, and they have to understand that they are facing an adversary that is committed to their destruction. And I think that as a consequence of that recognition, that's how you explain, for example, the decision that was made last week by the Chinese to slap export regulations on their rare earth materials.
Yeah, like following up on that, like that's a really good point to bring in Venezuela again, because maybe this is just top of my mind because I only recently read about this and learned of it, and you guys, it might be old hat for you. But the whole idea of the CIA strategy during the Cold War vis-a-vis the Western left to create a left compatible with empire. And for them, the only thing they needed was to have them have a negative opinion of the USSR. That's all they needed. That's it. Because they knew that they couldn't convert them to the cause of U.S. imperialism entirely. But if they could defang them by just saying, oh, neither Washington nor Moscow, like I'm a morally pure person, I don't get involved in this, then that was a victory for the CIA. And I think Venezuela is a great example of that, because you've had a lot of propaganda efforts aimed at the left to say, well, the Venezuelan revolution is degraded and Maduro is a dictator. So people on the left shouldn't be supporting him. And as long as they can get enough people to just say, you know what, forget about it. I don't want to die on this hill. Like, maybe he is corrupt. I'm just going to turn the other not the other cheek. Sorry, I'm just going to turn away. So, given that history, what what lessons would you want to impart to a younger generation of activists? What to be wary of when it comes to criticism of like really existing socialist governments would be the term from the Cold War, but you know what I mean. Like to try to create a compatible left by criticizing states that the U.S. ruling class wants to attack.
Well, I think that's what we're grappling with right now with the question on the table. That is to say that, I mean, just today I was watching Chinese television reports on the meeting about the 5-year plan that's being debated as we speak. And I found some of the commentary rather naive in the sense that they were comparing the Chinese experience with the Soviet experience and didn't invoke at all destabilization of the Soviet Union as a factor, which I thought was terribly naive on their part, but was contrasting it with how it's been executed in China with these 8% annual growth over decades, for example, as if the role of U.S. imperialism during the Cold War was not a factor. And I see that as sort of an ideological weakness. But at the same time, I'm also behind the cotton curtain and realizing that I need all the allies that I can get, even allies that may not necessarily be ideologically forward. And I've learned through bitter experience that one of the ways that you can chase allies away is to criticize them publicly, irrespective of what you say to them privately. Now, with regard to the point that you just mentioned, that was definitely the case. I'm looking in the archive of a leading CIA agent as we speak, and he was a big time Maoist at the same time, and was able to woo many black militants, quote unquote, and I'll mention their names because they passed away. Amiri Baraka, Robert F. Williams, for example. Uh, and of course, this idea that the Soviets were backwards, the Chinese were super revolutionary, peaceful coexistence was a sellout, China supposedly was against people. It really won many adherents. And I'm not sure what lesson we can draw for today from that particular experience, but you have to be careful with regard to these U.S. imperialists because they have many cards that they'll play. Now, with regard to the original question, say China and Israel, it hasn't gotten that much coverage, but Israel leaks sophisticated U.S. military technology to China. So there's a bilateral relationship. And of course, since a lot of the press in the United States is pro-Zionist and they want to keep up appearances, they don't necessarily trumpet this kind of duplicity. But it seems to me you have to factor that in with regard to China's relationship to the Zionist entity. That is to say, what are they getting out of it? And how does that fit into a longer projection, for example? And then with regard to the Soviet Union, I would argue that one of the major weapons used against the Soviet Union, which ultimately benefited Israel tremendously, was this old Soviet Jewry issue. You had these so-called progressive or liberal black mayors like Tom Bradley of Los Angeles, David Dinkins in New York. They were in the forefront of this movement towards Soviet Jewry. And of course, what that helped to do was to bring more Soviet Jewish people to the Zionist entity, which helps in the demographic battle with the Palestinians. And it would not surprise me at all if Moscow is well aware of that particular episode and how it was used as a weapon, because after all, there was historic anti-Jewish fervor in Russia, at least in the pre-Tsarist era. And of course, there was a certain attack on it in the post-Tsarist era. And so I think we have to take all of those factors into account as well. I guess what I'm ultimately arguing is that a lot of these knotty questions really need to be historicized, which does not mean that you drop the critique, but you bring more factors to the table so that we can better understand what's going on. Or, as used to be said back in the day, it's always best to explain before we judge and condemn.
I would definitely support that comment. I mean, these are very, very complex relationships that these various states have. There's no question about that. And this is a different time than during the so-called Cold War period, where we did see that, for example, in terms of liberation movements that were unfolding across the planet, that the Soviets were quite active in supporting many of those struggles. So that while they were attempting to try to maintain and develop a certain kind of relationship between themselves and the U.S. state, at the same time, they also were still, this is, I think, an objective fact, still providing significant material support to a number of liberation movements across the planet. That is a very different kind of dance that they were involved in than I think what we see today with the Chinese. The Chinese strike me as being very, very conservative, that they have their plan, they have their relationships, and they've been moving at a very methodical pace, not outstripping, not misreading the objective conditions in a way that would have them to take positions that they couldn't support, take positions that would undermine their longer term plans. But I think that these conditions are catching up with them in terms of, as we said earlier, this understanding that the U.S. is out to basically destroy them. That they see the Chinese as, in fact, an existential threat, and that the quality of the decision makers on the U.S. side is such that they are in that process of attempting to destroy the Chinese, will engage in fairly reckless behavior. And so the Chinese, I think, are beginning to understand that. But in understanding that, they have to begin to understand that it's in their interest to begin to help to shift the balance of international forces away from the U.S. by being a little bit more aggressive in their support for governments like the Venezuelans, like the Cubans, and it's dangerous, and they see it as a danger, and it's a real danger to do that. But the fact of the matter is, the way I see it, is that the U.S. is at war, and that war is taking various forms, and the Chinese and the Russians are beginning to understand that. The Chinese more than the Russians. The Russians there's some other serious contradictions with the Russians. But the Chinese that are theoretically supposed to be connected or committed to transformative politics, those commitments have to begin to take a more decisive material form in terms of providing support to movements, parties, etc. around the world. Let me just say real quick too, in terms of what Dr. Horne laid out about the influences that the Chinese had back in the day. That influence also impacted my grandfather on my mother's side, who was a card-carrying member of the U.S. CP, who basically left the party and became a Maoist because of his understanding of where politics were unfolding at that point.
Yeah, and I would say the lack of analysis. I would say also there seems to be what you're saying, that they're finally starting to wake up, for example, in China, is that there's and Professor Horne, or was that you, Ajamu, that you said that there was a bit of naivete? No, that was you. You said you were visiting China and there was a kind of naivete. I think you both said it, actually. There was a kind of naivete in China when it comes to imperialism. And Professor Horne said it when you saw this news program, or this program on Chinese program. Yes, now I remember. And I totally agree. I think there is a lack of analysis of imperialism in China, which is probably now burgeoning. It's slowly coming, but there is a lack of imperialism in China, analysis of imperialism in China. And I would personally, as somebody who lives in China, I would ascribe that to, for example, not only by not growing up in the heart of empire like all of us, but also because the West has been so successful outside of its borders to just indoctrinate the world with all that liberal nonsense, to the extent that even the children of the ruling classes in China would go to Ivy League schools and be indoctrinated with that crap. And I think that has everybody believes in that mainstream international relations idea of the world, instead of analyzing imperialism, which is totally excluded from all the curricula in Western academia. So I would say that is also something that plays a role. And also on what you said, Ajamu, about Russia and its almost inherent need to be part of the white empire. I totally agree with that analysis. I've noticed that too, and I think, for example, some of our colleagues, Vanessa, Billy, Fiorella, Isabel, would also say is something similar. And you see that now. I don't know if you guys seen it, but Putin just met with Al-Jolani of Syria, shaking hands with that new so-called leader, and I'm like, it almost. He almost, how can you say that? It almost, in Dutch we would say, it raise off of his, I don't know how to say it in English, it raise off of his being, that he just so wants to be part of that white empire club, and that he's now shaking hands with Al-Jolani. But of course, we don't know about the nuances, but I found that very, very
But
peculiar.
one of the most serious things about that relationship is that the Russians are looking out for their two bases in Syria. Those are very important spaces there. So, power politics, state power politics is such where you can have some strange bedfellows sometimes. And that's not to explain that away, but is what Dr. Horne was saying earlier. These are some very complex relationships, and there's a lot of things happening that we might not even be aware of. Like, for example, going back to Venezuela, we all know that the Chinese were expanding their refining capabilities to be able to import significant amounts of that heavy crude from Venezuela. So you got to have specialized refinery capabilities for that. And so this pressure now being applied to the Venezuelans is having a direct impact on those plans, their resource needs. And so one wonders if the decision on the part of the Chinese, because they don't engage in public diplomacy like the U.S., if that decision, it may in some ways be connected to that the decision on rare earths, connected to these moves that have been made, the pressure they are putting on Venezuela. The idea being, you screw around with some of our vital needs, our vital interests, and you're going to have to feel some of the pressure on the other side. So these are some very complex kind of relationships that are in play. A lot we know about, a lot we don't know about.
Yeah, I feel like I would be remiss having both of you here with your accumulated years of experience, being that we're speaking in English, we're on YouTube. The people watching this very well may include a lot of younger people who are are forming their political identities. They're learning about politics for the first time. Could you guys give them some more kind of concrete steps to take? Like, what organizations should they join? What groups should they be supporting, whether by volunteering or donations, etc.? What actual actions would you recommend that the younger generation of leftists should be doing now?
Well, first of all, footnote with regard to our previous discussion. Uh, I would prefer to think that some of the issues that we're discussing, that they are also being debated at the highest levels in both Moscow and in Beijing. For example, uh, you may recall that just before the overtures were made between Beijing and Washington about a half century ago, apparently, and I underline apparently, one of the top Chinese leaders, Lin Piao, was not on board and then wound up dying in a plane crash in Mongolia. Some say he was headed to Moscow, but in any case, it reminds me when I was living in Hong Kong and beginning to follow more carefully what was going on in China, and there was all this discussion about how the Chinese Communist Party was trying to learn the lessons of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I used to always think to myself, well, they need to look in their own files. I mean, the entente between Beijing and Washington was a signal factor. And so I dare say that I'm not the only person on planet Earth who's thought of that. I'm sure people in China are thinking on a similar level. And I don't want to, this has been reported. I don't necessarily want to contribute to any sort of internecine conflict, but you know, when I read these stories about what's happening with the Central Military Commission and the ouster of certain leaders in the Central Military Commission, recognizing the importance of that particular entity, and that when Deng Xiaoping was the paramount leader, he wasn't the head of the party, he wasn't the president, but he did have a pivotal role in the Central Military Commission. And so I think these sorts of discussions are helpful and useful to the extent that we can reassure many of our comrades on this side of the Pacific in particular that all is not lost, that there's not a certain blindness that's taking place at the highest levels, but for whatever reason, it's not broken into the public discourse. And to the extent that it does break into the public discourse, I'm not sure if that would be a step forward, depending on how that is executed. Now, with regard to your question, oftentimes, at least in the United States, if people can't read it on a small screen, oftentimes they're not having it, which I find very unfortunate. I think perhaps, Kareem, you could validate this given your field, but I find that reading newspapers on the internet, I don't find it as useful as reading hard copies. When I read hard copies, I tend to be more immersed. I'm not jumping around, following links. I have a deeper dive. I recall during my now forgotten youth, we were involved more in study groups, linked to organizations. I don't necessarily in the United States see that phenomenon taking place where people, a group of people, a collective, is studying a certain text or texts and then trying to inform and educate one another. As we were talking about China and Russia, I was thinking that to a certain extent, many of us, at least in North America, have been spoiled because our benchmark is the Cuban Communist Party. And if that's your benchmark in terms of ideologically, well, then obviously you're going to be disappointed quite a bit. But at the same time, you see that this ideological advance has not necessarily meant a disappearance of problems, for example, either in the highest ranks or even societally speaking. But just to sum up, once again, I would just say that there needs to be more wider study. And perhaps as a professor, I'm obligated to say that. But I don't necessarily see that even amongst many of our younger comrades.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that basically what we, as someone who's been involved right now in building a significant formation in the U.S., the Black Alliance for Peace, that we went about building this in what we call the old-fashioned way, or the old school way, a systematic process of building from the bottom up with absolutely clear radical politics, or as we define those politics to be radical. We believed, and it turned out to be the truth, that there was a desire for unvarnished radical politics among young people, and that's what we use. We took the position of Amilcar Cabral, tell no lies, claim no easy victories, to engage the people in clear conversations around what is to be done. What are the conditions that we are facing? And without sugarcoating things. And as a consequence, we were able to build out a pretty significant formation. So, what we do is to help people to understand their potential power, but that power has to be harnessed within the context of an organization, and that they should not feel in any way self-conscious about taking clearly radical positions. Of course, sometimes people would take positions that some people might define as ultra left or whatever. And that's all right. We know how to kind of deal with some of that. There's a lot of impatience and emotion because these are some very difficult times. But, working with these young people and helping people to understand that as tough as these times are, and they're going to get tougher, that if we rely on building power, working with the people, that the tides of history are with us, that the contradictions of this colonial capitalist system is such that basically there's no reform. And we absolutely clear about that. You can't reform this. While we have some reformist demands, those are demands that help us as in the process of building power. But we don't play with the idea that we're going to reform our way out of this situation. We make it absolutely clear, explicit. We are about trying to build a revolutionary movement in this country. We take a forthright position on imperialism, and we don't apologize at all for throwing our lot in with the people's processes in places like Venezuela, in Cuba, in Nicaragua. We are not going to be intimidated by the kind of contradictions and that we see with the so-called left in the U.S. And in Western Europe. So by having clear principle politics, clear language, revolutionary radical language, we believe that is the route that we have to go. Now, the situation in the U.S. is such where everything is accelerated now because this fascist consolidation moved even quicker than some of us anticipated under Trump. But we are in a better position than many because we never played with this notion of fascism. We understood that the fascist foundation was being laid by the neoliberal Democrats. So we weren't confused. We understood and saw the signs and pointed those things out to our members and people who would listen, that basically this was the trajectory of politics in the United States of America. And we were not going to allow ourselves to engage in the bullshit politics of criticizing the Trumpian forces that then inadvertently provided legitimacy to the backward politics of the neoliberal fascists. Okay, so we saw the bipartisan nature of this. We understood and watched and studied and debated the debates taking place among the bourgeoisie. And so we are been in a better place to be able to articulate radical politics, provide serious radical analysis than many of the formations in the United States of America. And so there's a reason why, everybody in the world heard of Black Lives Matter, because that goes back to, Peter, what you were referencing earlier. That was controlled opposition. Who cares about racial justice policies in a colonial capitalist context? Criminal justice reform and you're a colonized and exploited people? What is that bullshit? So we never even played with that, but that's the kind of politics that got pushed out there, controlled opposition, but we don't play that. We understand what the terms of struggle is today, and we're building our capacity as quick as we can in order to not only survive this next period, but to pave the way toward what we see as victory, putting our lot with the masses of the people in the global South, because that's where the revolutionary thrust is emanating from.
So where can people find the Black Alliance for Peace to volunteer, join, donate, etc.?
blackallianceforpeace.com. We need donations. We need support. And for those people who are not Black, we have a Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network that one can join that does outstanding work, providing support to and advancing the work of building a revolutionary movement in the U.S. and globally. Well, our work it goes beyond the U.S. We're working in every part of the planet at this time. We have our Zone of Peace campaign in the Americas, taking advantage of the fact that people are now understanding why it's important to re-embrace the call that was made by the community of Latin America and Caribbean states in 2014 in Havana to make the Americas a zone of peace. And now with the situation with Venezuela, people are beginning to understand why that campaign is so vitally important. We're working on the African continent where we are working to shut down the U.S. Africa Command. We did work in Central Asia, and we have a Indo-Pacific solidarity group, research group that didn't give up the work once the situation changed in Afghanistan, for example. So we understand the absolute importance of internationalism. That's part of the Black radical tradition. And so we have upheld that and trying to uphold that in building the kind of movement that we're trying to build and making internationalism real. So blackallianceforpeace.com. We have a new project that I'm heading up. I'm no longer the national coordinator for the Black Alliance of Peace. I'm heading up a project called the North-South Project for People-Centered Human Rights, where we are decolonizing the human rights idea. We are making the idea of human rights a revolutionary concept that emanates from the people, that the legitimacy of it stems from the people themselves. The people define the range of human rights, not UN declarations, covenants, and conventions. As important as many of those are, we move away from that kind of state-centric and legalistic orientation. And we put our faith with the people in terms of redefining human rights and using it as an instrument for revolutionary change. So you can also go to people-centered human rights project.com to get more information on that too. We're building movement and we're building power.
Well said. Well said. That sounds great. Sounds great. Any work, anything that you are working on currently, Gerald, that you want to highlight to the audience?
Well, only to congratulate Comrade Baraka for this multifaceted project that he's been working on. Of course, we intersect with regard to the U.S. Peace Council and
Exactly.
its multiplicity of activities as well. So those two entities, I think, are certainly worthy of support, particularly with regard to our beleaguered forces here in the United States. And as I said, particularly to our beleaguered forces behind the Cotton Curtain in Dixie, where I'm now sitting, which is one of the more reactionary spots on planet Earth.
Well, on that note, thank you both for this excellent panel. I hope we can do this again. This is absolutely fantastic. I could go on, but it's time to enter the day. Thanks again. Quick note: when I'm gonna close the program, please keep your browser open until it's uploaded for 100%, and then you can close it. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And good
hope
seeing
to
you
see you
again,
next
Dr.
time.
Horne.
Peter, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Ajamu, I was just about to say, you're about to get a member from Hong Kong, so watch out for the accusations of the Chinese are controlling Black Alliance for Peace and funding it. But yeah, that would just be me, not a member of the party. Yeah.
All right. Well, I appreciate that.
I know Code Pink gets that because there's some guy of Chinese ethnicity. I don't think even nationality, and the right went crazy with this whole line about how Code Pink is a Chinese plant.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
All right. Have a good night, gentlemen. See you next time.
Good night.
Thank you. So
Bye.
just leave everything open, right?
Yeah, leave everything open until it's 100%.
Okay.
All
All
right.
right.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
حبيت القمر طلع القمر اصطناعي شميت الورد طلع الورد بلاستيكي انا حبيت القمر طلع القمر اصطناعي شميت الورد طلع الورد بلاستيكي تكتيكي تكتيكي